A .3.3.2. Skill should be developed while engaged in daily activities. This skill should not be developed only when pain becomes severe. It can be practiced during ordinary daily activities by learning to notice physical sensations carefully and objectively. The more familiar we become with directing attention deliberately, the easier it becomes to use that ability when a difficult physical sensation occurs. Point 4. After emotion has taken control, minimize its harmful effects. Sometimes, despite all our preparation, an emotion takes control. At that point, the objective is no longer to pretend that the emotion is not present. The objective is to minimize its harmful effects. 4.1. Avoid taking actions until the refractory period is over. When a strong emotion has taken control, we should avoid taking important actions until the period of strong emotional influence has passed. This is particularly important when we are angry. A person may receive an insulting message and immediately write a long reply. 10 minutes later, the person may regret what was written. The modern equivalent is the familiar experience of sending a message while angry and wishing later that it had never been sent. Therefore, when emotion is strong, delay action. Do not make important decisions, send angry messages, or take irreversible actions while the emotional reaction is at its peak. 4.2. Switch the mind to an experience that generates a pleasant experience. The next method is to switch the mind toward an experience that generates a more pleasant mental state. This may be a peaceful activity, a pleasant memory, nature, music, a conversation with a supportive person, or another wholesome experience. The purpose is to move attention away from the emotional stimulus. For people who have developed meaningful contemplative or spiritual experiences, attention may also be shifted towards such an experience when appropriate. The essential principle is to give the mind a different object that does not continue feeding the negative emotion. 4.3. Attempt to change facial expressions to reflect a more pleasant emotion. Another method is to deliberately change facial expression so that it reflects a more pleasant emotional state. Our facial expression and emotional state are not completely independent. When we deliberately soften the face, relax the muscles, and adopt a calmer expression, this can help interrupt the physical pattern associated with anger, fear, or tension. This should not be regarded as pretending that a problem does not exist. It is simply another practical method of reducing the intensity of the emotional reaction. B. General behavioral patterns that should be cultivated to minimize the overall effects of negative emotions. So far, we have considered what can be done before an emotional situation, during the appearance of emotional information, and after an emotion has taken control. Now we come to general behavioral patterns that can reduce the overall effects of negative emotions. B.1. Acquire knowledge related to emotions, their background, and probable reasons. The first general principle is to acquire knowledge about emotions, their background, and their probable causes. We should learn to ask, why did I react this way? What happened immediately before the reaction? What kind of information triggered it? Was the intensity of my reaction appropriate to the situation? Understanding the background of our emotional reactions gives us an opportunity to manage them more effectively. B.2. Develop awareness to detect the early stages of emotional response. The second principle is to develop awareness that allows us to detect the early stages of an emotional response. This is extremely important. An emotional reaction may begin very quietly. We may first notice a slight change in breathing, tension in the body, a change in facial expression, an increase in mental activity, or the beginning of an angry thought. If we recognize the reaction at this early stage, we have a much better opportunity to respond appropriately. For example, during an argument, the difference between noticing I am becoming angry and noticing it only after shouting has already begun is enormous. Early detection gives us time to act. B.3. Since facial expression reflects the nature of emotion, by propagating friendly thoughts about others, we will minimize effects of negative triggers from others. Our facial expression can reflect our emotional state. Therefore, cultivating friendly thoughts about other people can help minimize the effect of negative triggers coming from them. Consider a situation in which another person speaks harshly to us. If we already have a strong negative attitude toward that person, the words may immediately produce anger.